All right, thank you very much. We are ready to start the second panel, Building Connections. And our speaker, actually, we're going to have only one speaker for two papers. Tom Gold, professor here at Berkeley, has generously agreed to read not only his own paper, but also the paper prepared by Professor William Kirby of Harvard. So I'm going to ask Tom to do his own paper first, and then after he's had his 20 minutes, we're going to give him another 20 minutes to impersonate Bill Kirby. Okay, Tom?
Thank you very much, Shelley. This paper explores the theme of mobile horizon, not through the practice and perspective of people originating from either side of the strait, but through a case study of the experience of an American-run Chinese language program which has served as the main training ground for leading China experts for nearly 50 years, some of whom are in the room today. This program, the Inter-University Program for Chinese Studies, or IUP, has been a beneficiary and a victim of the vagaries of cross-strait relations from the coldest days of the Cold War, when Americans couldn't imagine ever visiting the Chinese mainland, much less studying there, so they had to do their Chinese language study on Taiwan, to the current situation where younger cohorts go straight to the mainland and maybe never go to Taiwan. Because many of them will be leaders in numerous fields dealing with Chinese affairs, in partnership with National Zhengzhi University, IUP has undertaken to send small groups of Beijing-based students to Taiwan for a week of activities to familiarize themselves with the situation there, with the goal of deepening and balancing their understanding of the ever-moving horizon of cross-strait relations, and possibly serving as another bridge between the two sides. Now, this morning in his presentation, Professor Tian talked about how many personal interactions there were now across the Taiwan Strait. So what difference do foreigners make? I think it's because cross-strait relations are not purely an internal affair of the Chinese people, as Beijing asserts, especially because of the historical involvement of the United States and America's commitments, however ambiguous, as enshrined in the Taiwan Relations Act, which is an act of Congress passed in 1979. As I see it, it's critical for Americans to have a comprehensive and balanced understanding to inform their input into policy formulation, decision-making, and the training of future cohorts involved with this issue. Because the horizon of cross-strait relations is mobile, it's important to understand how the changing historical context shapes the understanding of these relations by those involved. Individuals as well as organizations are products of particular historical eras, but we also help to shape history. Over time, many people from the mainland, Taiwan, and abroad have contributed to the practice and understanding of relations across the Taiwan Strait. They have brought particular values, thinking, and expectations about China, Taiwan, global affairs, human society, human rights, and so on to their practice, often unconsciously. These views have not been static. In fact, along with the relations and larger context in which we act, individuals' perceptions have also evolved considerably, often unpredictably, as other chapters in the volume that we're working on indicate. We all have sets of things we take for granted about how the world works. As a rule, we do not reflect too much about these taken for granted, where they came from, how they change, or realize how much they change and why. Cross-strait relations is a good example of the changing nature of things we take for granted, and why mobile horizon is an appropriate metaphor for thinking about this. The horizon is both physical and temporal. During the Cold War, given the unremitting hostility between Taiwan and the mainland, direct relations across the strait were virtually non-existent. Both sides were armed to the teeth, and the strait was one of the front lines of the Cold War in Asia. America, as the main financial, military, and diplomatic backer of the Republic of China on Taiwan, certainly contributed to this tense atmosphere. For an American, from the 1950s through most of the 1970s, mainland China was a very distant horizon. Visiting it was virtually impossible, and traveling across the strait between the mainland and Taiwan, including the close-by offshore islands of Jinmen and Mazu, was beyond inconceivable. The few Americans who were able to go to the PRC needed to carry a separate passport and could not get a PRC stamp in it, even as a souvenir. The thought of doing scholarly research or studying on the mainland was likewise beyond fantasy. Even after China opened up, at first very tentatively to the outside world in the 1980s, travel to the mainland for Americans was very complicated, and only a tiny number were able to live there long-term as students, scholars, journalists, or businessmen. Their lives were tightly constricted and monitored. ROC passport holders could go only clandestinely and at no small political risk until the 1990s. And we heard about the changes in that, including now the nonstop flights earlier this morning. The point is, the things we now take for granted in cross-strait relations, the horizon, as seen from either vantage point, has shifted dramatically and continues to do so. As people engage in these practices, it changes their views and assumptions about the relations which continue to shape further developments. Beijing asserts that cross-strait relations are an internal matter of the Chinese people. Be that as it may, the facts are that since 1895, foreign powers have inserted themselves between Taiwan and the mainland, keeping the two societies apart and contributing to their very different historical trajectories. And the Taiwan Relations Act, passed by Congress in 1979, guarantees that the U.S., one way or another, is continuing to be a player in cross-strait relations. Over the course of America's long and complicated entanglement with Taiwan, Americans from a diverse array of social sectors have lived there for extended periods of time. Many of them went reluctantly because there was no possibility at all of going to the mainland of China, much less living there. Reluctant or not, residents on the island afforded them the opportunity to empathize, if not necessarily sympathize, with people in Taiwan from many walks of life and to see the world from their points of view. Some developed material and affective interests in Taiwan and actively oppose any arrangement that they see as turning Taiwan and its people over to Beijing's control, certainly without the very unlikely democratically expressed approval of Taiwan's voters, and some of the charts we saw earlier show how unlikely that is. 30 years after Washington and Beijing established formal diplomatic relations, many of these Americans continue to have outsized influence in shaping American policy, as well as public opinion towards China and cross-strait affairs. Some people argue that the U.S. government, business, and academic communities are too willing to kowtow to Beijing and have lost any sense of balance in their approach to cross-strait relations. They say that the new China hands spending all of their time on the mainland have little or no understanding of Taiwan and are largely unsympathetic to claims that America has a moral and material stake in not forcing a resolution of cross-strait relations that they perceive as likely to be detrimental to the thriving democratic, social, political, and economic system that American assistance and protection helped foster. Students of Mandarin Chinese were one group of Americans who resided at some length in Taiwan because of the inaccessibility of the mainland. In the second decade of the 21st century, Mandarin Chinese language teaching has become ubiquitous in the U.S. and has been growing around the world. Most American colleges and universities offer it, and it has become increasingly taught at the high school and middle school levels. Chinese immersion primary schools have appeared in many cities. PRC President Hu Jintao visited one such school during his January visit to Chicago. Thousands of American students spend summers, semesters, or academic years in China in one of dozens of foreign and Chinese-run programs now operating all over the mainland. As part of its projection of soft power, the Chinese government is setting up Confucius Institutes around the world, with 61 in the United States alone in late 2010. But in the 1950s and 1960s, only a few elite universities and colleges offered Mandarin. The Chinese studies community itself was rather small and clubby. Some of the founders of the field of Chinese studies in the U.S. had lived on the mainland prior to the 1949 victory of the CCP, but most received their initial training in the U.S. The only option for students to learn Mandarin, the official language used on the mainland in situ as a living language, was Taiwan. Learning standard Mandarin in Taiwan was not as obvious as it might seem. Mandarin Chinese as the official language itself was a rather recent import into Taiwan, and Shelley talked about that earlier. I won't go into that. Sure, everybody knows all about Guoyu and that sort of thing. By strictly enforcing the teaching of Mandarin as the official language, the exile regime also attempted to inculcate loyalty to the Republic of China as a nation-state of which Taiwan was merely one small province. In the view of some Taiwanese, Mandarin was the language of the authoritarian mainland-originating KMT ruling elite and another tool in its arsenal of repression. Nonetheless, for Americans wishing to hear Mandarin spoken widely and to be able to use it on a daily basis, the only option was to study in Taiwan. Many Americans went to Taiwan, as I said before, unwillingly, and they really hated what they saw as the hypocritical system there, which characterized itself as free China. They went to study Chinese there reluctantly. Few were academically interested in Taiwan as a subject of research or inquiry. They went there purely to master and live the language. Beyond study in schools, they stayed with local families or in densely packed neighborhoods, picking up the rhythms of daily life in Taiwan beneath the surface of political discourse, as well as traveling extensively around the island. Inadvertently, many became aware of pockets of dissent in Taiwan's closely monitored society, especially when these became more vocal and active in the late 1970s. The elite Mandarin program was IUP, the Inter-University Program for Chinese Language Studies, which grew out of a program started by Stanford. So it was known as the Stanford Center, even though it was the board comprised representatives of many different universities. The teaching center was at National Taiwan University, or NTU, or Taida. IUP enjoyed backing from the highest officials in the ROC and Taida, particularly the Ministry of Education. It did not, however, have an official agreement with Taida. Quote, in the late 1960s, the president of Taida shook hands with Professor Van Slyke from Stanford, who was the executive director from 1963 to 1997, parenthetically, and that was it. Clearly, having links with so many elite American universities, research universities, was a boost for Taida's prestige and for the ministry. IUP became the place for the study of Mandarin for those intending to pursue a career requiring a high level of proficiency in the language. From 1963 through the 1994-1995 academic year, 1,303 students had attended IUP. The top 5 sending institutions were Michigan, Berkeley, Chicago, Stanford, and Princeton. They were nearly all postgraduates in PhD or professional programs, and they came from all fields: history and literature, sociology, political science, law, and anthropology in particular. In 1978, the U.S. and the PRC signed an educational agreement, and even though there was a centralized Washington-based body, the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the PRC, which arranged most of the exchanges, immediately many American universities, including Stanford, started to establish their own exchange programs. Not surprisingly, this new opportunity to study Chinese in the real China posed a major challenge to Taiwan-based IUP. Many board member institutions rushed to establish their own exchange programs with China while retaining their positions on the IUP board. Nonetheless, in 1979, after the U.S. and PRC established formal diplomatic relations, the IUP board passed a formal resolution expressing its intention to remain in the ROC and its belief that Taiwan provided the best possible environment for the advanced study of the Chinese language and Chinese culture. The board also began to discuss setting up a presence on the mainland while maintaining IUP Taiwan. Since many of the students at IUP intended to conduct research on the mainland anyway and had little interest in Taiwan per se, it made sense first to do their language work on the mainland and simultaneously build up the guanxi for their future careers. Additionally, although the PRC was under a hard authoritarian regime, Taiwan was still governed by a one-party system. So Taiwan had very little attraction for students, most students of Chinese. By the 1990s, the political scene in Taiwan had changed dramatically, and we've heard quite a bit about that, as well as the new questioning about deep reflection about Taiwan's identity and history, including the use of Taiwanese. Within intellectual circles, there were ongoing debates about Mandarin and its ability to represent authentically the people and culture of Taiwan. At the same time, there were major structural and administrative reforms underway at Taida. All senior positions became elective, which meant that candidates and officers felt bound to their increasingly restive constituencies and unable to make decisions on their own. The Ministry of Education lost much of its influence over internal university affairs. An American academic called upon to conduct an external review of IUP in the summer of 1995 remarked, quote, "The change in atmosphere at NTU reflects Taiwan's economic evolution and the rapid democratization of social norms that has occurred there in recent years. It is astonishing to the returned visitor." In 1994, Chen Shui-bian was elected mayor of Taipei, and perhaps not coincidentally, the College of Liberal Arts, the Wenshui-yen, began to assert its rights over the language building where IUP the Stanford Center was located. At the same time, Americans interviewed for this essay noted there was also a strong Taiwan for the Taiwanese atmosphere growing at Taida and resistance to the idea that Mandarin was Taiwan's national language. The implication was that foreigners should come to Taiwan to learn Taiwanese, not Mandarin, which was referred to as Beijing Hua, or Beijing dialect. If they wanted to study Mandarin, go to the mainland. A Chinese scholar noted the de-Sinicization trend at the time, and he told me, in meetings everyone was asked the question, do you love Taiwan? It is important to note that although IUP had close ties, including financial support from the Ministry of Education and Taida, most Taida personnel did not know what IUP was, despite its central campus location. Even many Americans referred to it as a xiaozujie, a little concession, recalling the unequal treaties. In the minds of some important people, IUP was not seen as contributing much of anything to Taida's prestige or intellectual life, and given the contentious internal Taida politics over space and identity, IUP was quite vulnerable. The center of gravity for Mandarin training was quite naturally moving to the mainland, but IUP still did not have plans to vacate Taiwan completely. Some foreign students placed an ad at IUP placed an ad in the China Post saying, quote, "We may be young now, but in the future we will be taking positions in diplomacy and international trade. If Taiwan continues to be indifferent towards Mandarin training, we will in future go to Beijing and as a result build relation on the mainland and not Taiwan," end quote. In the end, IUP moved completely out of Taiwan, and at the end of summer session 1997, that's when they moved and established a language teaching program at Tsinghua University for the fall of 1997. I became executive director of IUP in 2000, and soon after that, I made a trip to Taiwan to attend a conference. I was approached by a senior official of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a top administrator of Zhengda, and they expressed profound regret at the unpleasant circumstances of IUP's departure and the bad blood this has generated, even though they were not personally involved. And they acknowledged that Taiwan had sacrificed a jewel, a victim of the overheated political climate of the time. They suggested that IUP move back to Taiwan, this time to Zhengda. I presented this proposal to the IUP board, which not surprisingly rejected it. In the fall of 2002, John C. Thompson became IUP's resident director. He had retired from a career in the U.S. Information Agency, much of which was spent in Taiwan and the mainland. I told him about the request from Zhengda, and we agreed that Taiwan had a lot to offer to students of Chinese affairs on its own terms, and that it would be a good idea for the elite students at IUP Beijing, most of whom had never gone to Taiwan, to have a chance to get a sense of the place before embarking on their diverse careers, particularly during the Chen Shui-bian administration, when tensions often got quite high across the strait and in Taiwan-U.S. relations. We thought it was important for IUP students to have a broader view of cross-strait issues, which only a structured visit to the island could provide. We tried to conceive of a way for IUP to broker new ties between Taiwan's scholarly community and the new generation of American China scholars, short of an actual return of IUP to Taiwan. As products of their historical context, the students at IUP Beijing are largely unaware of the numerous scholars in Taiwan knowledgeable about the topics of their research or the abundant resources in Taiwan. Thompson and I devised a plan to send small groups of IUP students who ideally had never been to Taiwan before to spend a week on the island. They would first receive a general orientation about the Taiwan experience from local scholars as a way of understanding not only the facts, but also the interpretation put on them. They would then spend 3 or 4 days learning about research in their field and professional opportunities by visiting archives, universities, think tanks, businesses, media outlets, NGOs, and so on. Finally, they would travel outside Taipei to gain an understanding of more of the entire island and its diverse society. The program was approved by the Ministry of Education in December of 2004, and there have been 7 delegations which have gone, and there's one in the process of going next week on this program. They average about 5 students each. The goals, without adopting a political position, we just wanted to introduce Taiwan as a vibrant society worthy of study in its own right, as well as a place rich in intellectual resources and materials essential for comprehensive research on many China topics. Should the students enter the realms of diplomacy, politics, or public opinion touching on cross-strait relations, they would have learned firsthand and on-site about some of the concerns on the part of the different people from Taiwan, thereby informing their counsel and practice. They don't have to agree with the points of view they hear in Taiwan, but we thought it was important for them to hear them. And another objective was for them to build a unique set of bridges across the strait as well as with each other based on this special experience. And so just the results have been the students have come from a variety of different fields. Most are graduate students or early career professionals. They've been very positive about their experience. They've all said that they had no understanding of Taiwan whatsoever and that they feel that the program has been very valuable to them. In the paper, there's a set of rich quotations that many of them have put in their
about trees.
The one about trees, you'll give me an extra 10 seconds for
I'm going to give
that?
him some of Bill Kirby's time to read this quote.
The one about trees. One of the many surprises to me was one participant wrote of the drive from Taoyuan Airport to Taipei, quote, "We couldn't take our eyes off how lush were the greens, how pure the blues. Life seemed to be unfolding in living color. Beijing receded like a distant gray memory," unquote. And quote, these are surprising to many of us who've lived in Taiwan for a long time, but that's part of the point of it. And quote, "Clean roads, protected nature reserves, orderly lines, and generally soft-spoken people. It took time to get used to receiving the Taiwanese version of your welcome, 不用. Each time, overwhelming hospitality reminded me to discard my hardened Beijing shell and say thanks more often," unquote. And so, anyway, the point of the paper is to talk about the way that this organization and Americans have been caught up in the Sturm und Drang of cross-strait relations, the mobile horizon, and in the hope that this program that we've conceived makes some sort of a positive contribution to bridging the two mobile horizons across the strait. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Bill's paper is written in very small type. And a lot of it is very technical. And so just gong me when I've tried to take some parts that
He's
will be
not
interesting.
kidding. It's in like 8-point font.
Yeah,
It's
which is cheating.
very petite.
Cheating. It's called Global Business Across the Taiwan Strait, the case of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited. I'm not used to reading papers out loud in any case. One early morning in December 2008, Morris, did they say Zhang or Chang? Morris Zhang, the founder and chairman of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, was preparing his monthly management team meeting at company headquarters in the Hsinchu Science Park near Taipei. Having led the firm to become the world's largest dedicated semiconductor manufacturer or foundry, Zhang had to ponder the future of TSMC's development in China, the world's second largest market for semiconductors. Zhang and his colleagues had spent more than 4 years evaluating China before building a fabrication plant in Shanghai in 2004. Their business in China, however, had not grown quite as they had expected. Chinese semiconductor design companies, which were the major clients for a foundry like Taiwan Semi, were yet to be substantially competitive in the global market. Political constraints from Taiwan and elsewhere limited the company's capacity to apply leading-edge technologies there. While talent supply was more than abundant in China, with hundreds of thousands of engineers graduating every year, hiring, training, and retaining them had become a major challenge to TSMC managers. Meanwhile, Zhang was facing a very different industry landscape from that to which he had become accustomed. The semiconductor industry was projected to undergo single-digit growth over the next few years, down from the regular double-digit growth recorded for the past 4 decades. TSMC, which Zhang viewed as a global company headquartered in Taiwan, also confronted new challenges from its customers and competitors. Some customers, Zhang worried, sought to commoditize TSMC's services and pressed for lower prices. Competitors from Taiwan, Singapore, and most recently China all added further downward pressure on pricing as they struggled to fill up idle capacity. Might China still be the missing link in TSMC's strategic roadmap that would help sustain the company's future growth? Would the election earlier in 2008 of a new president of the Republic of China on Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, fundamentally change the calculus of TSMC's mainland strategy, and if so, how? TSMC's success would depend on accurate assessments of both the global business environment and the political climates on either side of the Taiwan Strait. So the paper examines the development of TSMC and its mainland strategy. It explores the emergence of the Chinese mainland market for semiconductors and the rise of TSMC's primary competitor in Greater China, the Semi Manufacturing International Corporation headquartered in Shanghai. Third, it evaluates the outcome of the deliberations of Morris Chang and his colleagues as they sought to navigate both a global financial tsunami and the choppy waters of the Taiwan Strait. Finally, it offers an opinion on the implications of the recent history of TSMC on the mainland and in Taiwan for the future of cross-strait investment and the prospect of political unity across the Taiwan Strait. Now, on the semiconductor industry, semiconductors are a crucial component in almost all electronic products, from personal computers and mobile phones to DVD players and flat panel display televisions. In 2006, worldwide semiconductor revenues stood at $255 billion. Before the 1980s, the industry was vertically integrated with integrated device manufacturers, IDMs, such as Intel, Motorola, Texas Instruments, and Philips, undertaking all these processes internally. During the early 1980s, facing the rising cost of building fabrication facilities, which are known as fabs, and a drop in semiconductor prices, many IDMs started outsourcing the fabrication process to other IDMs that possessed idle capacity. In 1987, Morris Chang founded TSMC and made it the world's first pure foundry. That is, it took part only in the fabrication process, but not in the design or marketing of finished products. Subsequently, fabless design houses, that's not fabulous design houses like Dior, it's fabless design houses such as Chips and Technology, Cirrus Logic, Qualcomm, and Broadcom, that's not in Bill's paper, emerged to focus on design innovations, enjoying the high margins of selling semiconductors without the enormous capital required for building fabrication facilities. At the end of 2007, IDMs represented 80% of the global semiconductor output, with the top 4 players each generating over $10 billion in revenues. The largest fabless design company was Qualcomm. Okay. The semiconductor industry is known for its volatile nature, for it is driven ultimately by consumer demand for electronic products. Industry revenue usually peaks in the third quarter of every calendar year in preparation for holiday demand, declines in the fourth quarter, and bottoms out in the first quarter of the subsequent year. The overall trend, however, has been one of gradual downturn as prices of semiconductor chips continue to drop. Morris Chang has been synonymous with TSMC, and some could argue with the foundry industry as a whole, due to his role, vision, and execution of an entirely new business model, the pure foundry. He was an engineer and businessman, not a political man, but his leadership of TSMC came in response to opportunities created by the ROC developmental state. While Taiwan's international political situation deteriorated in the 1970s, the ROC made concerted efforts to develop new export industries to strengthen Taiwan's regional and global position in the absence of formal diplomatic relations. In 1978, it created the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group to assist both state-owned and private enterprises to break into areas of high technology, such as semiconductors. The state-sponsored Industrial Technology Research Institute, or ITRI, sponsored research and development and encouraged the return of U.S.-based Chinese to Taiwan to lead the charge in the computer industry. By 1999, Taiwan led the world in the production of computers and peripherals, claiming a 91% market share in the production of scanners, 68% in keyboards, 64% market share in motherboards. Zhang had led the worldwide semiconductor business at Texas Instruments. In 1985, he was recruited by the ROC government to head ITRI. In that capacity, he founded TSMC in 1987 after securing initial equity from the ROC government, local private investors, and the Dutch electronic powerhouse Philips. As a 25-year industry veteran, Zhang had witnessed and participated in the birth of the semiconductor industry, in which TI was a forerunner in the research, development, and commercialization of various IC-based innovations. He identified wafer fabrication as the most complicated and capital-intensive process along the entire value chain. He proposed the establishment of a pure foundry. It would assume all costs of acquiring fabrication equipment and of the physical fabrication process, but it would not compete with its clients in chip design, nor would it sell chips to supply chain members. The pure foundry would easily scale its production capacity up or down according to an individual customer's needs. Such a business model freed independent designers from the burden of building their own plants and maximizing plant utilization. They could concentrate instead on creating designs and layouts to be used on the chip. TSMC's facilities were located in 4 major clusters, 2 in Hsinchu, Taiwan's Silicon Valley, 1 in Tainan, and 1 now in Shanghai. Different products on multiple production lines for hundreds of customers could be easily transferred among fab plants within a single cluster location. Proximity and flexibility also speeded production. In spring 2006, one of TSMC's cell phone chip clients was able to start its 65 nanometer product in volume production 6 months ahead of schedule. TSMC was founded when there was no semiconductor industry to market to speak of in mainland China. Yet the year of its founding, 1987, witnessed the end of martial law in Taiwan and the cautious beginning of cross-strait cultural and economic exchanges that would significantly change both the mainland and Taiwan. In the PRC on the mainland, Chinese leaders Zhao Ziyang and Deng Xiaoping sought to emulate the experience of Taiwan and other Asian tigers. Entrepreneurship was encouraged with the legalization, or at least toleration, of multiple forms of private enterprise. State-owned enterprises were increasingly corporatized, and foreign investment and expertise were sought. As in the case of Taiwan, economic development was guided by an increasingly strong technocracy. China entered a stage of export-led growth that would dwarf even the Taiwan miracle, and it was based in significant measure on investment and expertise from Taiwan. But as the flow of venture and human capital from Taiwan to the mainland gathered momentum, the ROC governments of President Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian from 1988 to 2008 sought to regulate and limit the scope of Taiwan firms' investment on the mainland. Fear that Taiwan investment in the mainland could lead to economic dependency as well as a sharply deteriorating cross-strait political relation after 1996 meant that businesses such as TSMC were under great political pressure to limit their interests on the Chinese mainland, even as the mainland economy was taking off. Mainland Chinese governments, particularly at the provincial and municipal levels, were eager to enhance domestic production by offering preferential treatment and encouraging partnerships with multinational firms. Political obstacles existed nonetheless, as the U.S. and more than 30 countries that had signed the Wassenaar Agreement, an international protocol that forbade its signatories from exporting semiconductor manufacturing equipment or technology capable of producing chips of less than 180 nanometer to China. Taiwan, while not a formal signatory to the agreement, enforced its strict dissents for fear of losing significant industrial and military advantages. Approval for ROC companies to build 8-inch fab in China would only be given after their Taiwan-based 12-inch facilities had been built and had reached stable levels of production. The ROC government under President Chen restricted investment on the Chinese mainland by Taiwan-based firms in other ways as well, notably by limiting the mainland investments of any Taiwan firm to 40% of its net assets. Starting in 2004, TSMC operated an 8-inch fab plant in Shanghai running on 250 nanometer node with a monthly output of 32,000 wafers. Unlike TSMC's leadership in the global market, its Shanghai plant enjoyed only a 15% share of the foundry market in China. In 2007, Rick Tsai, CEO and president of TSMC Shanghai, explained, quote, "In the beginning, it was difficult for us because our strengths do not play into the Chinese market directly. Technology for the Chinese market is 1.5 to 2 generations behind, and it is very price sensitive. We never sell our chips for cheap. We sell our chips for value. But the Chinese design houses are also moving upward in their technologies, so our values are becoming more prominent to them." There was an abundant supply of engineering talent in China, with over 350,000 engineering students enrolling in Chinese universities by 2005. Competition was expected to heat up as Intel, UMC, and other competitors began to contend for leading graduates. TSMC held roadshows in campuses across Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing, and Zhejiang to recruit graduates who could fit in with the company's innovative and service-oriented culture. TSMC's presence in China also helped the company build up partnerships with design houses. The existing travel restrictions between China and Taiwan made visits to fab plants in Taiwan difficult for IC designers from China. It could take more than 3 months for them to obtain visas. Having the facilities in Shanghai made engineering discussions more convenient and allowed TSMC to organize technology seminars and other training opportunities targeted at Chinese design houses. In forging relationships with these firms, which had, for reasons of cost and politics, worked primarily with domestic foundries, TSMC sought partnerships for the future. Its leading Chinese mainland rival was the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, founded by Richard Zhang, no relation to Morris. He started it after Worldwide Semiconductor Manufacturing, the chip company of which he was president, was sold to TSMC in 1999. SMIC enjoyed preferential treatment from the Shanghai government, as TSMC had from the ROC government in its early days in Hsinchu. To close the technology gap with TSMC, SMIC entered into strategic agreements to strengthen its competence in processing leading-edge technologies. With all this competition, TSMC had important geographic choices to make. How and where should it invest next? On the competitive front, SMIC and other Chinese foundries were catching up in technology. Since China's national policy was to encourage indigenous enterprises to grow in the semiconductor industry, TSMC had to identify the best strategy to embrace opportunities there while keeping its competitors at bay. Should it expand capacity in China? What kind of technology should it consider moving to China if it expanded further there? Or should it keep most of its activities in Taiwan while searching for other countries in which to locate additional capacity? TSMC still enjoyed cost advantages in building a fab plant in Hsinchu, benefiting from the cluster effect, a strong supply of engineering talent, and higher performance cost ratio. In China, the hurdle to become truly successful would be the ability of the local employees to acquaint themselves with international standards of running a global company. TSMC, one of the most important and one of the first few truly global companies to emerge on Taiwan, had determined during the Chen Shui-bian era that its future lay in part on the mainland. Why had it done so? The evidence above shows that it was not to save costs. Its major expenditures on the mainland would be the enormous capital cost of building fab facilities, and mainland salaries for the best engineers were rising fast. Nor was the attraction the new mainland fabless design houses, given their comparatively low quality and lack of track record. They would continue to underperform. Perhaps its purpose was to confront head-on a potential Chinese rival, SMIC, which, like TSMC on Taiwan, had been born from the state industrial policy and which was the recipient of enormous official patronage. Yet SMIC, for all its ambition and support, would not prove competitive with TSMC, either on the mainland or globally. Upon further analysis, several factors were decisive in leading TSMC to establish its first plant on the mainland, and each had a political dimension. First, there was a wish to be close to TSMC's international customers, the firms that assembled electronic goods in China using TSMC chips. Second, it wanted to tap the mainland's growing great wealth of engineering talent. Third, a less easily quantifiable but important factor was a broad sense of unease about the political direction of cross-strait relations and indeed their potential future restrictions on cross-strait investment. So a major reason for TSMC's first sizable investment in the mainland was simply to get out of Taiwan. It was this changed political landscape that TSMC announced that its next major investment would not be on the mainland, but on Taiwan, and this after the election of Ma Ying-jeou. TSMC declared at the end of 2010 it planned 2 new 12-inch water fab plants in Hsinchu. Taiwan is doing business in China in a big way. 70% of firms surveyed by the ROC Ministry of Economic Affairs admit to investments on the mainland. This includes small and medium-sized enterprises which locate sunset industries to China and larger industrial and technology companies such as TSMC. Let me just see his final punchline here. In the long run, cross-strait trade and investment can be expected to benefit by a normalization of political relations, but economics alone will not determine political outcomes, which is a theme of the morning's panel. Even in an age of economic interpenetration, states and the global companies headquartered in them are more important than short-term economic actors. Thank you. Stop. On behalf of
All right, thank you very much. A marathon. 40 minutes of nonstop talking. Thank you
just
very
getting
much,
started.
Tom.
Just getting started. You're welcome.
Our discussant for these two papers is Professor Dittmer, and does he have 15 minutes or 20 minutes? 15 minutes for you.
That will be plenty. I think that after that marathon performance by Professor Gold, that we'll probably want to hear from the audience somewhat more, and so I think my comments will be, I think, fairly limited. So we have two very interesting papers here, and both of them are what we'd call case studies, or in the political science department we'd call case studies. In other words, that they're sort of micro studies of a particular sector of something bigger that's going on, that we can say sort of draw generalizations about. And they're both historical narratives. And what's the advantage of a case study? Why do we do case studies anyway? Well, I think part of the attraction is that case studies get right down to the nitty-gritty. You get right, you lose the sort of big overview, but you sacrifice that in favor of getting right down to what's going on in a particular time, place, context, historical period, and so forth. And the hope is that with this case study, you can generalize from that to the larger whole of which it's a part, of which this case is a part. So what do we have in common with these two studies? Well, they both illustrate, I think, and it's kind of hard to say because they're so nitty-gritty. I mean, very specific in their description of two very, very different sorts of things. Tom's paper was on the migration of the Stanford Center, what used to be called the Stanford Center, to the mainland, with the delicious irony that we have here, that the Stanford Center, the democratization in Taiwan, that was very much in Taiwan's political interest and in America's political interest, resulted in the eviction of the language training center from Taiwan, because it resulted in the rise of the Taiwan independence forces, who were less welcoming to American imperialism. And so this sort of nexus of power and culture and scholarship and money was broken up and had to migrate away from Taiwan. And from Professor Kirby's paper, we learn all about fabless foundries. I still don't know what a fabless foundry is. I explained it. And so forth. I thought you did. So they're both case studies. What are the differences? One is the migration of scholarship from Taiwan to the mainland and back. I guess we wind up with the Stanford Center coming back to Taiwan in a limited capacity. And the other is a study of the migration of business to the mainland. So what do they tell us? And business is coming back too. Apparently, it's coming back to Taiwan. This Taiwan Semiconductor is migrating back to Taiwan, back to Hsinchu for its next plant. So it illustrates, I guess, on a large, in a micro scale, the integration of the mainland and Taiwan. The scholarship part is complicated by the fact that the U.S. is a major part of it. Not to mention language training, intellectual biography, and things like that. But so the U.S. plays a role, a third party. But that's and also is scholarship different from business? Do they migrate for different reasons? Scholarship. So that's what they have. That's what they have in common, and that's what they have that are different about them. I think. What do they tell us? What's the point? Well, that the Taiwan and the mainland are getting closer, that the horizons are moving closer together. I think that's one of the major points, I think. What questions do they raise? What questions do we want to ask? I have some questions now. Professor Kirby's not here, so I can ask a lot of questions to Professor Kirby, right? And he won't be here to answer them. Why did they go to the mainland? Why did the businesses go to the mainland? He says it was not for cost considerations. That sort of reminds me when you see a film in which the businessman says, it's not about the money. I'm kind of skeptical. It's not about the money. These are businessmen, right? These are not philanthropists. We have done interviewing with Taiwan business people who invested on the mainland. And we found that if one industry goes to the mainland, everybody else has to go too. Why? Because they have an advantage. Why do they have an advantage? They're able to produce more cheaply. So that was our experience. So that I would have a question about that they don't go for economic advantage. That would they are somehow able to produce more cheaply, and once one goes, the others have to follow, or they're undercut by that one that goes. So I would be skeptical about that. Now it might be that the reason they went didn't pan out. I mean, they came for the market, for example, the Great China Market, and then they didn't get into the China market, so they export a lot of their products, export to America, export to Europe, and so forth. And so the Great Chinese workshop of the world becomes an export platform. So they came with one expectation of selling to the China market, and then shifted. I would be interested in what the customer base is of these Taiwan Semiconductor, and then so that would be one question I'd like to know more about the Stanford Center. What would be the questions we'd ask about the Stanford Center? Did the Stanford Center move pay off? I guess that would be one question we'd want to know. Did it pay off for Stanford? What do we have here with Stanford? I mean, we had this sort of nexus on Taiwan of money, politics, education, a very insidious sort of combination that the Chinese were really upset about. And then it moves to Tsinghua, moves to the mainland. Did the same sort of nexus get built in the mainland? This sort of confluence of money, power, scholarship, and so forth, a sort of center of did that follow to the mainland or not? I don't think it did. I mean, because the Taiwan Center, as you point out very, very clearly in your paper, the Stanford Center, became a very, 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 very formative in the formation of American scholarship. Is that still true? Is the mainland experience decisive in interesting American scholars in the mainland in the same way it was for Taiwan? So that would be one of the questions. I guess I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Dittmer, and we are ready to take questions, comments from you. So please jump in.
But not all at once.
Even all at once, I think is all right.
Well, I could take Lowell's.
Sure.
The question Lowell asked about money, power, and scholarship. Actually, I think the payoff has probably been very great and much greater because, as I'd mentioned, on the reason that most American students of Chinese went to Taiwan in the first place was because they couldn't go to the mainland. They didn't have an interest in going to Taiwan per se. While they were there, they might have picked up, the point I was making is picked up some understanding of the Taiwan point of view, Taiwan culture about a lot of issues, but they still did not see their careers as being in Taiwan. And I really don't know how many IUP grads, that time Stanford Center grads, made their careers in Taiwan studies or on Taiwan. Whereas from the IUP Tsinghua, we're in the process of trying to build up an alumni association, and a high percent of our graduates stay on the mainland, not only on the mainland, but in Beijing. And pretty much every time I go to China in order to celebrate my arrival, we have an alumni do. We have a function, and it's part of it is building guanxi among the alums who are in Beijing. And I think they see IUP as being really formative and decisive, I think was the term you used, in their careers. That it's partly the language training they get, I dare say, is superior to any other program, but also the guanxi that they get at IUP, and also being on the Tsinghua campus and across the street from Beida, also is, you can't put a price on that. So I think that the payoff has been great.
Then can I ask a follow-up question to that? If your students are staying in Beijing, that suggests that they're not academics. They're not coming back to the U.S. and entering the academic community here. And it seems to me that what was so formative and important about IUP in Taipei was that it shaped a generation of scholars in the U.S. by giving scholars the experience of having lived in Taiwan. So has the move to Beijing changed the type of students that are in the program and the career path that students are taking?
Very good points. When I took, it's a personal, I mean, I'm not sure how much this is, well, when I took over IUP, I'm not disparaging anybody, but when I took over IUP in the year 2000, we were at about 50% capacity. And Tsinghua was extremely unhappy that we were so below their capacity because IUP was not being promoted. It had moved from Stanford to Berkeley in 1997 and was sort of trying to run on its name as the Stanford Center, but it was no longer at Stanford and it was no longer at Taida, and it was going down the tubes. So one of the first things that I did when I took it over was to boost enrollment by changing some of the original policies, was that you didn't have to stay for an entire academic year. You could stay for a semester, a summer, or any combination. You could, we opened it up more aggressively to undergraduates, to people who were unaffiliated. And though looking through the minutes of previous annual meetings, there had always been a group of unaffiliated, which meant people who were graduates of college and were using a gap year to work on their Chinese to strengthen their applications for grad school. But we also have now a number of people who are, say, in service. We have consultants, journalists, Chinese medical people, people in finance. We have professionals, so that they're the ones who are likeliest to stay in Beijing or in China are the professionals. This increases their worth in their careers. And of course, we also hope that they will become donors, because we've never tried to develop an individual donor pool before. The other thing, though, the academics, you're right, they do not, the preponderance of our students are still people who are in PhD programs, but they do not, I mean, IUP is still a very important experience, and every time I go there, it's quite clear. People come up and say to me, oh boy, this is just a wonderful experience, and the guanxi that I'm making in the among fellow academics is also extremely important. Not only, among other, I've also tried to internationalize it. So it's not just Americans, but we have more Europeans, we have more people from Asia, Australia, and so on. So the point being that I'm trying to build a sense of a global community of scholars as well. But given globalization and everything, that's also part of going with what's out there. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's maybe too long-winded, but that was really good that you asked that. Oh, now that's
Yes.
sparks.
Yushan?
And this is a question for Tom. I would like to know if you can say something about the comparison between the Stanford Center and the Inter-University Service Center at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. And the reason I'm asking this is it seems that both are relatively open to foreigners, especially to American students, when mainland China was relatively closed. And their values seem to be decreasing as a result of the openness of the of mainland China's own universities and facilities and so on and so forth. And they are both terribly important in the formation of American scholarship on China studies. This is one of the reasons. The second question is, you said that it was probably politically depressing for American students to come to Taiwan to learn the language, but they don't like the political atmosphere, etc. Would American students experience the same kind of feeling as they are studying in mainland China today?
And you can hand it to Michael. He's next.
I have a footnote in my paper about the University Service Center, because the University Service Center, which initially was downtown near the old Kai Tak Airport, and then moved out to Chinese University of Hong Kong, is not a language program. It is a research center which serves scholars from around the world. For language training, it was not an option. Hong Kong was really not an option. If you wanted to learn Mandarin and hear Mandarin spoken on the street, no matter how badly accented, but if you wanted to hear it on the street, you had to go to Taiwan. That was the only option. In January, I went to USC, to the University Service Center, to speak to the director, Wang Shaoguang, about establishing a Hong Kong familiarization program. Exactly for the same reason, because I feel that USC, as Taiwan, has an enormous amount of resources which the younger generation, the younger cohorts of foreign American scholars in particular, may not be familiar with. Now, at Berkeley, a lot of our grad students do spend, I mean, some of it because I push them. I push them, and I think Kevin O'Brien, who's really a USC veteran, push it. Do you push it? You going to Hong Kong?
Not as much.
Not as much. Okay.
Not as much.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. But I mean, I think that it's a way, because when I went there, I saw the unbelievable amount of resources they have, but they are going online. They're putting more and more of their resources online. But also, I gave a lunch talk, and people go to, I was looking around and said, wow, this is just terrific. But the problem is, Hong Kong, as small as it is, sort of like our relation with Stanford, is they don't go to USC except unless they have a reason to go there. It's not really as community building for the scholars in Hong Kong as it is for the foreign scholars who end up there, if that makes sense. On the Americans depressed about the political situation in Beijing, probably not. I think they see, and this is a whole interesting topic to explore, but I think most of them see China as so rich in opportunities that they turn a blind eye, and China makes no pretense of being free China, and you don't have a Cold War atmosphere, that they see it as opportunities. So I mean, one career track that I did not mention, which has been critical for many IUP grads, is NGOs. Some IUP students have met at IUP and founded NGOs, which are very active in China. So that's part of the community building aspect of being at IUP, as well as their optimism that they can do a lot there and that they can contribute a lot to China's development, not only economic development, but also social development, particularly civil society.
Michael.
I have two comments for Tom. Rather than questions, this is, of course, our last chance as the contributors to the book to talk about the project, so I hope you won't mind that I'm going to make two comments rather than questions. The first is, I think the paper would benefit from drawing out in rather more detail the consequences for the American scholarly consensus on cross-straits relations of the shift symbolized by the movement of IUP in basic language training from Taiwan to Beijing, or from Taiwan to the mainland. Warren and I were talking last night. The two most recent cross-straits relations articles in Foreign Affairs both basically say that America should abandon Taiwan. And that's the thrust of those articles, that the only sensible thing is to make absolutely clear that America would not come to the aid of Taiwan in the event of a conflict, basically to give up on Taiwan. I think that would have been unthinkable from scholars educated, from American China experts educated in Taiwan. I think that the positions would have been different, more nuanced, and probably contrary. So one area I'd like to see more discussion of is what are the intellectual consequences of this shift? The second comment I have is that I think the paper, it's in no way to disparage or to challenge the success of IUP and the growth of IUP over the last decade, to point out that the reason why a lot more Americans are staying in Beijing to run NGOs and work as consultants and bankers is not just changes in IUP.
Oh, of course not.
It's also changes in China.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the paper might be of broader interest if you could bring that into the paper more centrally. For some of us in the room, when we started, well, probably for many of us, when we started studying Chinese, it was kind of a lunatic choice, right? There was no future in devoting years and years to learning Chinese, whereas that's totally different now. It's totally normalized to devote many years of your education to China because there will be opportunities there. And I think, to me, that's sort of a place where the paper has potential to speak to larger issues than the IUP and the Taiwan Familiarization Program itself.
Sarah Friedman, last question.
Thanks. At risk of beating a dead horse, Tom, I'm going to weigh in with building on the past few comments in thinking about the consequences of the move from Taiwan to the mainland in terms of scholarship more generally. And here I think you are also speaking to the issues raised by Professors Wu and Dittmer in terms of the strategic tripartite relationship, whether we want to call it a menage a trois, I'm not sure. But I do think you can say much more about the production of knowledge, particularly the production of knowledge about China and its larger political, social, economic effects. If we assume at this point in time that all knowledge is situated knowledge, it's a viewpoint from somewhere, I do think, as Michael just said, experiences on both sides of the strait can be really formative in shaping how scholars view cross-strait relations, view the U.S. relationship with Taiwan and China. And I think that's something you can bring out much more forcefully in the paper and frame it more broadly, whether it's about the production of knowledge, whether it's about some of the issues that Michael was raising. I think that will make the paper then speak to more of the broader issues that we're all addressing in the volume as a whole. And I think you have great material to do that from. And I'd encourage you to do so.
These are great suggestions for a book, not for an article. As it is, I've tried to at least raise a lot of these kinds of questions. I think, and this is, to do a literature review is beyond my capacity to try to, and also I don't know that anybody could trace back their IUP experience in Taiwan or on the mainland. And but the point I'm just trying to make is that this idea of empathy and as living there as having a different kind of softening, or Michael, I guess, used the term nuance, is providing some sort of nuance. Now, I don't know, did either of those two, Bruce Gilley or what's his name, Glazer, have they spent time on Taiwan? Do you know any? Do you know their?
I know Bruce studied only in China.
Yeah, he's Canadian too.
Canadian, that's why I know.
Nothing. And there's some of my best friends are Canadian, but but the other thing, No, I've given you, this is some useful language for thinking about things, but let me see, Michael, I don't know that there is a scholarly, can use the phrase consequences for American scholarly consensus. I don't think there is a scholarly consensus. I think if there's a scholarly consensus, I think it's supportive of the idea of IUP, the elite program, moving to Beijing. I think there's no question that that's the scholarly consensus. But did it have to be either or? And does it therefore mean you become hostile to anything having to do with Taiwan? And I think it in the early day, in the early days and through much of the early part of the 2000s, given the political situation in Taiwan, I think there was a sense of hostility. There was a lot of bad blood before I took it over, and even after then, towards what they felt had been done to them in Taiwan by certain players in Taiwan. But I think, I don't know, Nancy brings us the view from Washington. I don't know if there's any if you would say that there's a consensus on thinking about any of these kinds of things. I think I'm all for complexity and nuance. And that's why I think that there's a great deal of diversity and a lot of opportunity. But in terms of, was the move a wrong move to make? No, I think IUP's initial plan was to have an operation on the mainland as well as keeping the one at Taida. And they felt that Taida was just becoming too hostile and that they couldn't stay there.
All right, I think it is time for lunch, and we never want to get in the way of that. Are there any logistical announcements that need to be made? Very well, then. We will reconvene in 1 hour at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.